Hello, everybody. Today is July 26th. We're in the house of our parishioners, Xenia Wilkinson. We will cover several stories that are super interesting to me. Probably the most interesting one is the story of her father, who was part of the Hilliard mission that happened in Serbia, in Second World War, rescuing more than 500 aviators, American aviators. We'll talk more about it. Xenia got a PhD from Georgetown University. She will talk. Her thesis is fascinating. It's about rubber production in the Second World War too. She'll tell us about her personal life, and so let's get going. Xenia, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for having us at your lovely house in Washington, D.C. Yaroslava St. John the Baptist.
Yes.
So can you tell us about your upbringing in New York City?
Yes. I was born in Washington, actually, during World War II at the end. And my mother was living here and working for the Yugoslav embassy at the time, the government in exile, but married to my father, who was away in Italy in the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, working on helping resistance movements in the Balkans and elsewhere. So after the war, a few years later, we moved to New York City around 1949, 1950, and we bought a house. My parents bought a house in Jackson Heights, New York, in Queens, where they lived for the rest of their lives and where I grew up. So it was a very nice life. I was an only child. I would have liked to have sisters or brothers, but it didn't happen that way. And my mother was very traditional. She was very well educated, university graduate in English literature, very cultural, but she was also very traditional Serbian. And she was born in Yugoslavia and very much liked her life there. So when she came to the United States, she wanted to keep up the customs, the language, the religion, and the traditions. My father was a little more American. He was born in Pittsburgh, but when he was high school graduate during the Great Depression, when his family, which was an immigrant family, could not have afforded to send him to college, he won a scholarship given to Yugoslav American young people as an experiment given by the Serb National Federation, which is an insurance company in Pittsburgh. And later we learned co-sponsored by the royal family of Yugoslavia, the Serbian dynasty, Prince Paul probably. And this group of young students, mainly Serbian Americans, went to study in Belgrade. So he was also very influenced by his time there, but he was a little bit more American, having been born in the States. He got very involved in the church and was the president of the board of the church in the 1950s. He also had his own business in aircraft parts as a distributor of aircraft parts. And I went to school. I wanted to be American because my friends were Americans, but I was also learning some Serbian after I learned English. And of course, we observed the holidays and the traditions, and my parents had many friends who were Serbian immigrants.
Your first memory, are they of Washington, D.C. or New York?
Well, I was a baby in Washington, so my first memory was that we lived in an apartment in Washington, and I had a crib with my favorite stuffed animal, who was a green giraffe. And so he had a long neck. And at night, when the moonlight came in one night, very strong moonlight, the giraffe's shadow grew on the wall really high. And I started to cry and cry. And my mother came in and said, "What is wrong? Why are you crying?" And I said, "Giraffe, giraffe." And she said, "Here's your giraffe. It's your friendly giraffe. Giraffe, giraffe." And she couldn't figure out why the giraffe was making me cry. So that was my only memory of those very, very early days.
Not a nice one, but it's a cute story. So when you were young, what were your interests growing up? elementary, middle, high school?
I was interested in reading a lot, like my mother. She really encouraged me to read good books. And so I was reading a lot of classics and literature, and I loved literature. Also somewhat interested in history because many people came to our house when I was a child and a teenager who were coming from Yugoslavia with their stories of either escape as refugees or immigration or what happened in the war and the families, and some former Chetniks and some former fighters too. My family was very generous in helping them get started in the States. So I heard a lot of those stories, a lot of discussions about international relations, so I became interested in that too. Later I was interested in chemistry. I did well in it in high school and became very fascinated with chemistry. So I considered being a chemistry major or a history major in the end. And my sports, I was not a great sportist athlete at all, but I liked ice skating and I liked tennis. I still try to play a little tennis to this day.
We all do with Novak Djokovic in our midst.
Oh, I'm a great fan of Novak Djokovic. It's wonderful. And my husband took me to Boise, Idaho, several years ago. Of course, he's been gone for 10 years. When the Serbian team came to play against the American tennis team in the Davis Cup.
Uh-huh.
And the Serbian team won most of the matches, so I was very happy because they were not by any means the favorites. But Novak Djokovic and other team members came, and that was a great pleasure to see them in person.
You went to Columbia University?
I went to Barnard, which was the Women's College of Columbia University. At that time, there were no women in Columbia College in the 60s. And it was considered the best college in New York, so my parents were very good to not only, of course I had to get in, but not only send me there, but they had to, of course, pay my tuition, and they were very dedicated to my education, and I very much appreciate that. My mother had graduated from Belgrade University, the first generation in her direct family of women to graduate. We had men my grandfather was an engineer, but my grandmother did not have a college education. So I'm proud of her for doing that in the 1930s. And her cousin, Xena, after whom I'm named, also graduated and became a doctor, a medical doctor. So it was a generation of women who were getting into the professions. So they encouraged me also to go to college and become a professional.
And you
something.
So you graduated as what was your major?
I ended up in history.
Okay.
I gave up chemistry after organic chemistry and labs.
Oh.
Very demanding. But I loved history too. So I was a little bit torn, but it ended up history.
Okay, so we will maybe stay on this path. You were in the Foreign Service, but then after retirement, you went back to school and got your PhD?
I did. I was in the Foreign Service for 31 years, though. So it was a long career. And then I retired in my mid-50s, and I asked Georgetown where I had gotten my master's degree in Middle Eastern history. I applied to Georgetown to see if they'd take me back for a PhD. I had a friend who was doing that already, older person too. And they did, and they were interested that I had lived a lot in Latin America in the Foreign Service. We'd had posts in Mexico and Honduras and Brazil, and I was also at the U.S. mission to the Organization of American States, and I'd also been to the United States mission to the United Nations to work. So they thought that was an interesting background to build on in my academic career.
Nice. So, sorry for jumping. So, after you graduated college, how did you meet your husband?
Oh, I met him in the Foreign Service much later.
Okay.
So I met him when I was posted to the United States mission to the United Nations, and he came to work during a General Assembly only for a couple of months but I met him there. But I didn't see him again for several years. And then we were both in the Middle Eastern Bureau in the Department of State. And I was working on Israeli Arab affairs, and he was working on North Africa. And I ran into him again. And then we started to talk and become friends again. So that's where it started.
What year did you get married to?
1981.
81, okay.
I would like to add, because I think the audience might be interested, that when I entered the Foreign Service in the late 1960s, women who got married, officers, I mean diplomats, had to resign, while the men were encouraged to get married as soon as possible. I don't think the women thought that was totally fair.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, Ginger was telling us too some of these interesting gender-related stories from her time. Let's see. So you actually, how did you move to DC?
Well, first I came here for my master's degree in Georgetown, and then I had already taken the Foreign Service exam and passed, and then I passed the orals too. So I had that offer pending while I was doing my master's, and then they wrote me and said, your offer is about to expire. So I decided to try it, and this was the right place to be already. I was already here, so I stayed here.
Okay.
And this became my home base
Okay.
after that.
Okay, nice. Well, we're glad to have you here to share these
Well,
stories.
thank you.
So I mentioned in our introduction that it was fascinating to me, your PhD thesis about rubber production in the Second World War. Can you summarize that for us?
It's hard to summarize one's own thesis because it's so long, but I'll give it a try.
Okay.
So during World War II, the Japanese occupied Southeast Asia and took the rubber plantations. So there was no more rubber production, natural rubber production, which would be sent to the Allies anymore, the British and the Americans. Very little left. And the Amazon is really the original source of rubber. So the Roosevelt administration negotiated an agreement with Brazil and other Amazonian countries to sell all their surplus natural rubber production to the United States. And the Brazilians were very enthusiastic about this and cooperated by sending more than 30,000 impoverished Brazilian farmers and ranchers from the arid Northeast desert into the Amazon to tap rubber, because the way you extract natural rubber is you go to the trees in the Amazon and they're dispersed among other biodiversity, and you slash the bark rather scientifically so that only the latex comes out, but you don't kill the tree. And then you collect it, and then you smoke it. It's a difficult job and very isolated. And so these men were sent there because there was a shortage of labor in the Amazon to do this work. And so I wrote about this entire experiment. The Americans sent rubber technicians from the Department of Agriculture to look at their methods of production and try to encourage them to produce more and analyze how they were doing. And they traveled all over the Amazonian region with Brazilian counterparts. And so they wrote very interesting reports of what they found, including Indian rubber tappers, women rubber tappers, and then these men who were sent from the Northeast. And so I wrote about this entire experiment. There was no, at the time, there was no synthetic rubber, so this is what the Allies depended on. And they were sending some. They used some production for themselves, and they sent the surplus to the United States, so it did help. But at the same time, the United States was developing the process of synthetic rubber, so by 1945, they had enough to supply the war effort. And then this effort of the Amazonian rubber tappers ended in 1947. But it was a short experiment, but very intense and very interesting. And I was able to go to the Amazon and do research, which I enjoyed very much.
It probably tipped the scale a little bit in the favor of the Allies during the Second World War. It was.
It did, because without rubber, the war, they couldn't function. Nothing would work. The tanks, the jeeps, nothing. They desperately needed rubber. And they got it from the Amazon. They got a little bit from Liberia, too. And the British got a little bit from Sri Lanka. But there was a desperate shortage. The Germans were way ahead of us on synthetic rubber, so they were already producing it.
Going back to New York, you mentioned you attended that church. Is that the one that burned? What was it,
That's a
10
great
years ago?
tragedy that it burned. It's our only church in New York, St. Sava's Serbian Orthodox Cathedral. It was a very beautiful church. I loved it. And it was an old Episcopal church built in the mid-19th century. And it had a congregation of many prominent people, including Edith Wharton, the great author who was married there. But by the 1940s, the congregation had moved uptown, and it wasn't used very much. So when the public learned about Draža Mihailović's uprising against German occupation and his brave resistance fighters, which were written a lot about in the early 1940s, the Episcopal Church decided to give the Serbian Orthodox Church their church for a very, very modest price of something like $20,000. But it's a very big property. There's a church, and then there's a church hall, or there was a church, and a church hall, and quite a bit of property, and a townhouse for the priest also. So it was very generous of them, and then the Serbian Orthodox congregation moved in there. And my parents were quite active, especially my father was active with the congregation.
Do you remember what kind of life it was for the Serbians? Well, you were too young, but post-war, immigrants coming, and your parents were helping some, I believe you mentioned before. Yes,
I remember. I remember very vividly that people would come and talk about how they got out of Yugoslavia if they had to escape. Some of them had to escape. Some of them later were able to immigrate. We had relatives who got out, including my mother's cousin, Milenko, who was an aeronautic engineer, and his wife, and then two very young boys. And they had to escape, I guess, because he was in a very valuable profession. So they got through the Alps, the Slovenia and the Austrian Alps, and got out that way. And my aunt even wrote her memoir about that escape, and it was quite dramatic. So I remember them, of course, and I'm still friendly with their sons. Unfortunately, my aunt and uncle have passed. And then there were many other people whom my parents helped, and they told many stories. There were men who had been in prisoner of war camps in Germany, who had been officers in the Yugoslav military before the surrender. So they had their own stories, including one of my relatives. And really, really nice people. They had a hard time initially. Some were very educated and were able to get good jobs after a while, after they learned a good command of English. And others were not. They were unskilled or just semi-skilled. So they had a little harder time. But I think in time they found their ways. There was a lot of opportunity. And the United States in the 1950s and early 60s was really economically number one in the world. Everybody was buying our products because Europe had been so devastated by war. And so there were quite a few opportunities. So some people whom my father helped, or my mother and father helped initially, they became a lot richer than we did, and they did very well, and we were proud of them.
Let's see. Let's mention your daughter. She lives in Florida.
Yes. So Julia was a great blessing, and is still. She was born in Mexico in 1983, and she's a lovely girl. Oh, this is my cat Angel, by the way, who's a very important member of the family. She's like another daughter. We lived in Mexico at first, and she learned Spanish before she learned English. And then we moved to Honduras, and she also was very bilingual. And then she came to the United States, and she was about 3 or 4 when we came back. and we put her into a Montessori school here right on the Chevy Chase, Maryland, I think it was. And the teacher called me up and said, "Mrs. Wilkinson, I don't understand. Your daughter, Julia Wilkinson, doesn't really speak English very well." So I said, "Well, we've been living in Latin America for several years, and she's learned both, but her Spanish is stronger than her English because she had Spanish-speaking nanny, and I was working, and we spoke both languages at home." She said, "Well, please, so that she can catch up, just speak English at home. Don't speak Spanish anymore." So then she switched. My daughter was sensitive to this, so she switched to English and kind of gave up her Spanish. And then it wasn't until we went back to Mexico several years later that she resumed her Spanish. And she's very, very good at languages, so she speaks Spanish and Portuguese and English, all trilingually.
Okay.
So she's a good linguist. She grew up overseas in Latin America quite a bit and loves Latin America. And then she came home to finish high school here at Murray. And then she went to the University of Pennsylvania for her college. And she did BA in history.
Okay.
And then she later went to Columbia to do a master's in public administration. But before that, after she graduated from college, and she had a first job as a paralegal that she didn't like very much. So she was lucky enough through my husband, and they were on a vacation in Dominican Republic, to meet some people from Goldman Sachs, the famous financial company. And they were looking for somebody who knew Brazil, where we had lived last post, and spoke good Portuguese. And they tested her Portuguese and invited her down for interviews and hired her. So she worked there for about 6 years before she went to Columbia to do her master's.
Okay.
And now she's working independently as a consultant in what they call ESG, Environment, Social, and Governance, an alternate way of investing, but with the idea of improving the environment or social issues or corporate governance, bringing more women and other diversity into corporate governance. And so she's doing that on her own. She had left Goldman Sachs to go to Columbia. So now she's always been very idealistic, and she's become a big advocate of this and climate change and all those issues in the environment. So she's on her own. She's a consultant, much more modest means than working for Goldman Sachs, but she loves it. And she's now engaged to be married to her longtime beau, Alvaro, and they're planning to get married in May in Spain. He's a Spaniard.
Okay.
So we're very excited about that.
So we'll get to travel there too.
Of course. It's going to be in Menorca, which is an island next door to Mallorca in the Mediterranean. They're planning a destination wedding.
Nice.
So very exciting. And I'm very delighted that my daughter is getting married to him. And
Great.
I'm sorry that Ted won't be there, but he'll be there in spirit.
So do you get a chance to visit your daughter a lot, or is she visiting you more? How does that work for
Well,
you
we
guys?
do visit a few times a year. She was last here for my birthday in June. She and Alvaro gave me a beautiful birthday party. And I had an unexpected visitor. It was a party in a restaurant that I liked. And they took a private room. And suddenly the lights went out. And then there was a flash of colored lights. And I was puzzled. And in walked Elvis Presley. And it's true that I love Elvis Presley. I mean, I love his music. And when I was 12, I wanted to marry him. But never expected
Didn't
this.
work out.
No, it was just a dream. I never met him. But I like his music to this day. And in he walked, an Elvis impersonator. And he greeted me and sang to me. And it was really lovely and a great surprise. So that was their last visit.
Oh, great.
Then our next meeting is going to be in Serbia in September. We're going to the 80th anniversary of the Halyard mission, the commemoration, in both Belgrade and Pranjani.
September. What September?
September 21st is the ceremony in
Okay.
Pranyani, and that's in the mountains of kind of towards the south, but central south of Serbia, not far from Čačak, I guess, and Ravna Gora is the area. I've been several times before, and even Julia's been a couple of times with me. But since it's a very special anniversary, being 80th, it's going to be a bigger ceremony, commemoration. So my two stepdaughters are coming, and their husband and partner, and Alvaro, the fiance of Julia, and his son. He has a grown-up son and bride. So they're all coming. So I think we're a party of 11.
Oh.
And then there'll be other people who are, right now, they're pretty much the descendants of the rescuers and the people who rescued the pilots and airmen from the OSS and Air Force have all passed. And then there are just a few of the airmen who are still alive because they might have been 18 or 19 when they were shot down. But they're probably not traveling anymore. But several of their descendants do like to come. And then there are the local people who sheltered them and helped them, and at great risk to themselves. So a few of them were still alive when I last went in 2019, and some of their descendants are very actively involved in the ceremonies. So we hope the president of Serbia will be coming. He came to the 75th, where I was present. The American ambassador normally comes every year, and now the British are usually coming, and some of the other allies. And then some American generals come from Germany, and some ministers from the Serbian government. So it's quite a nice high-level attendance. And then they all, after the big ceremony on this makeshift airfield that was created from a cow pasture by the downed airmen when they were sheltered by the Serbian farmers, and the Serbian farmers helped too. They created a makeshift airfield with their hands and with hand tools so that the first airplanes could land and rescue them. Otherwise, they couldn't even be reached by the Americans to be brought back. Well, that airfield has now become a memorial airfield to help the Halyard mission.
So just to roll back a little bit for our viewers, to explain what was actually happening, can you go back to the 43 when the Allies were flying over Yugoslavia to bomb the Romanian oil fields, and just to give a little bit of background, what was happening?
Yes. The Germans relied quite a bit on oil from Romania and these refineries that were in Ploiești, Romania, that they occupied. And the Americans and the Allies knew that that was an essential part of the German war machine, so they were bombing it. But it was a fixed target because they knew they were coming, so they had a lot of anti-aircraft there, and many American, British, and other planes were shot down. But they were told in 1943-44, if you can't make it back to Bari with your disabled airplane, then see if you can parachute over Yugoslavia, because you might be picked up by the partisans or resistance movement rather than be imprisoned by the Nazis. So a lot of them did that. But many of them were parachuting in territory controlled by General Draža Mihailović and the Chetniks. And the Americans, led by the British really, had broken relations with Mihailović and decided to throw all of their support to the partisans who were communists, and Tito led them. So they didn't think that Mihailović's people were going to rescue Allied pilots. And the Americans and British had withdrawn their mission to Mihailović. They had nobody there anymore. They used to. So my father, who was in the Office of Strategic Services posted in Bari, Italy, was getting word that there were some American pilots and airmen with Mihailović. He never actually told me how he was getting this information, but they were in intelligence, so probably some people were getting out and making it to Italy, or there were some ways of getting some information. So he was advocating a mission to rescue them, and the British and some of the Americans didn't believe it. They said, no, Mihailovich would never help us. So these are just tricks by the Nazis to say that there are people just to lure us in. And the State Department agreed with the British, but my father persisted, and he contacted the Air Force, and they said, well, if these guys are our guys, we really have to find out and try to help them. Meanwhile, my mother was at the Yugoslav embassy in Washington, which was run by an ambassador who was with the government in exile, and he got a cable from London, from this Yugoslav government in exile, saying, we have heard from General Mihailovich by radio that he is holding American airmen whom they have rescued, but he really needs an evacuation mission. He cannot hold them indefinitely. And could anything be done to organize such a thing? So the embassy, the ambassador, Fotic, showed this telegram to my mother saying maybe your husband could be of help because they knew where he was working. So she just wrote a letter to him by military mail and asked, dear George, can you help these American airmen get out? So that gave him his second corroboration that this is really a true story. And then with that kind of evidence, the Air Force said, well, to hell with the politics. We really need to find out if these American airmen are there. And they sent a list of questions which were to be radioed to Mihailovich's headquarters. And some of them were trick questions, but the American airmen were to answer who they were and then something about their background and make sure that they were really, truly who they said they were. And they passed. They were truly said that, who they said they were. So then they were told, clear the airfield so that an airplane could land at night, clear the pasture. And so that's how they were working on this pasture and trying to make an airfield where I visit when I go to the commemorations that a C-47 plane could land on.
Mm-hmm. So it was your dad and a few other Serbians who had key roles in the operation?
Yes, my father was the organizer, pretty much called the architect of the Halyard mission. And so once the Air Force was assured that this was a mission worth taking, then the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, General Donovan, Bill Donovan, he's quite famous, he went to President Roosevelt and said, we have to get these people out. I don't care about the politics so much, but we have to get our people out. And the President approved it, even though we had told the British we would break with Mihailovich. He said, I'm not changing the policy, but yes, you're approved to have a mission and a liaison down there. So my father was not permitted to go. The British objected to him going. It's said that Churchill objected. Could have been through his son, who was attached to Tito's mission. But anyway, that's what he thought. Anyway, he could go. So he asked for the role or the responsibility of naming the head of the mission, and he named Nick Lalich, who was a member of our parish. I don't know if you ever knew him. Wonderful person, great friend of my father, too. And so Nick headed the mission that went and took over the liaison responsibility for the Halyard mission. And they also sent a radio man, Arthur Jibilian. And so there were, I think, 3 people.
George Mussolini?
George Mussolini was Nick's predecessor, but he was in first. Mm-hmm. And then he was withdrawn and Nick came in.
Okay.
But George Mussolini was there earlier when we had a mission. And he was really close to General Mihailovich and his men.
Okay. Is he also from this area, George Mussolini, or just Nick?
Nick grew up in Ohio, I believe, but then he settled in Baltimore. He married Mira from Baltimore. And all I know is Joanne Mussolini lives in this area in Virginia. And Joanne is George Mussolini's daughter, but I never knew Mr. Mussolini very well. I didn't know where he was from. Joanne just wrote me that she wouldn't be able to come to the 80th anniversary commemoration. I was very sorry, but we are in touch. And she came to that showing of that wonderful new movie, Heroes of Halyard, that was made in Serbia and shown in the capital here in Washington. So we were all there. Stephanie Lalich, daughter of Nick, and Joanne Musselin, daughter of George Musselin, and me. So we were recognized as the daughters of the big actors in the Halyard mission on the
Yes.
American side.
Actually, Bishop was telling me, I didn't realize, I saw you because I knew you, and Bishop Ine was telling me, but by the time he informed me that Lalich's daughter was there and Mussolin's daughter, they already left, so I didn't get a chance to meet them. But maybe we could do, after you get back, DC reunion of the daughters.
That would be great, and I think Stephanie would be worth interviewing. She's been working on a book about her father, so she knows a lot about him, and she has some documents and artifacts to show. In fact, I want to show you a few things after my interview is over, because we have a dagger that General Mihailovich sent to my father to thank him for the mission and the operation to evacuate the airmen. But one thing that is very interesting is that after they cleared this airfield and they were all ready, they sent the first C-47 at night because they were afraid the Germans could see it otherwise. And it landed, and Mihailovich said to all of his men, bring in all the Allied airmen to this airfield at such and such a day at such and such a time, and have them assembled and ready to go. So the airplane lands with 24 seats for passengers and the crew, and they get out and they see 512 men waiting for them. Nobody had any idea on our side that it was going to be hundreds of people. It was expected to be just dozens. So then they realized we have to rethink this mission. This is hard. And so they took, of course, they took the ones who were wounded or, who had been there the longest first. And then they went back and said, first of all, we cannot fly this mission at night ever again. It's dangerous to land on this airfield at night. Can't see much. And secondly, we can't go over and over again at night. So they decided to fly it during the day. And the Tuskegee Airmen, who were the African-American groups of pilots who had fighter pilots, they were assigned to accompany the C-47s to protect them. And then they veered off at the last minute to attack the German garrison at a local airfield to distract them. Fortunately, they were not shut down. They all survived. And this was distracting the Germans, so they would not be focusing on Ravnagora or Pranyani. They'd be focusing on an attack on them. So it's a really good strategy. And General Mihailovich also had his men form two circles, two very big circles of cordons around where the airmen were. So they were well protected, and they all got out safely. This lasted for about 4 months. And then the Soviets came into Yugoslavia. And with the partisans, they were pressuring Mihailovich. And of course, the Germans were retreating. So Mihailovich couldn't keep his headquarters where it was. And he retreated with his men to Bosnia, taking the remainder of the airmen who had not yet been evacuated with him, and Nick Lalich and his mission too. So the last missions were from Serbia, Bosnia, near Doboj, I believe. Drina Rajic knows a lot about that, so she would be a good source. And she's planning some commemorations there.
So they had planes in that area land and pick up the remaining of the pilots?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And there was a very dramatic and rather sad scene that impressed me from the time I heard it, which is probably when I was a child. And that was that the last plane, they had orders and permission for Nick Lalich to ask Draza Mihailovich if he wants a seat on the plane to get out, because he was being surrounded and he knew that things were really very bad. And he said, thank you, but I'm staying with my people. I will not leave my country. I'm going to share the fate of my people. And from then on, I thought he was a great hero because that was a great sacrifice. He could have been brought to safety to Italy with the airmen, but he refused.
And I would imagine that the poor pilots that ended up in that independent Croatia state, that they would be imprisoned and probably killed or something. But do you know what was happening with the ones that were picked up by Tito's army or communists?
Not too much. My father's view was that they were not treated well. I'm not sure because I'm a historian, I don't have any documentation. John Capello, who runs the president of the Halyard Mission Foundation and who also runs the commemorations, former military attaché, Air Force attaché of the United States government and the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade, he tells me that yes, there were rescues by the partisans as well, but I don't have much information about it.
Okay.
I know that there was one, and I did see the documentation about one that was, I believe, rescued in Macedonia by the partisans, and so that's the only one I had any documentation about. As for the fascist state of Croatia, when they were the so-called independent state of Croatia, they would have turned them over to the Germans.
Right.
And then they would have ended up in POW camps. I don't think they would have kept them for themselves. That would have been very politically hot for them to keep American airmen in prison. I don't know about other allies, but they probably had to turn American, British, Canadian to the Germans, and there were Germans all over Croatia at that time. So.
And Germans, they obviously knew they were shooting those planes down, so they were hunting for these airmen. Definitely. Everywhere, right? So
when they saw the parachutes, they would try to go after them. So when they were parachuting in Ravna Gora in that area, what would happen is the resistance, the Chetniks would go and quickly grab those guys, cut down the parachutes and bury them right away, and then take them to farmhouses to be sheltered. Because they knew those parachutes were giveaways of where they could search for the Allied airmen. And of course they knew that they were going to come to Ploiești, and they shot down more than 1,100. Many of them didn't make it. I mean, many of them died because the planes just didn't make it to any place.
Right.
So there were a lot of casualties among the Allies as well.
But it was also weren't Germans offering great rewards for any American pilots, and people still.
I'm not aware of the rewards. It could be.
No.
But what I am more aware of is that they were offering very drastic punishments for any villages that sheltered the airmen. And there was one village that was burnt because they were found. And there was quite a dramatic, another dramatic talk with General Mihailovich and the American liaison officers. This is before we broke relations with Mihailovich. And the American airmen were very concerned because they knew that this village was under threat. And they said, you know, we're prepared to give ourselves up and we'll just go to prison camps maybe. We may not be killed. So we shouldn't sacrifice these local villagers. And Draža Mihailovich said, no, I know the importance of sheltering you, and I've made the decision. So you're staying with us, and unfortunately the village will have to accept the fate. And that's what happened. And that is documented by Richard Feldman, who was one of the airmen, who wrote a book about his experience. So that was a decision, and he said we watched the village burn. So they were very, very punitive with the Serbian people, and maybe many other peoples too, but they said for every officer, they take 10 people and kill them. And you remember what happened in Kragujevac with the schools and everything. So they were more threatening than rewarding in my reading of history, but there may have been a reward. I just don't know about it.
Yeah, I think it was 10 for each soldier and 100 for each officer.
And 1,000 for a general. So It was very drastic.
So it's amazing that those
None of them was betrayed. Nobody was betrayed of all those people who were sheltered. Not one was given up, even when they volunteered to give themselves up in this case.
right. That's just amazing, just amazing fact to me that those people living in those villages in the war, they didn't have much for themselves to feed their own families, and they still sacrificed even their life just to protect them.
They did, and many of them remembered that they were fed by these people who didn't have enough food for themselves, and they found that some of the families were sleeping in the barn to let them have the house, even though it was a very humble house. And if there was a new airman who was sheltered and complained to the others, why are we staying in such bad quarters with such bad food? Then the ones who had been there longer said, we're going to take you to how the family lives that are protecting us, and you'll see. And they were wonderful. So I've been staying, as we all have, at this wonderful inn in Pranyani, which is made out of the farmhouses of the person who was at that time the biggest of the small landowners and probably kind of the village chief. And he sheltered a lot of the airmen, so some of their descendants would visit. But after the evacuation, he was killed by the communists, unfortunately. But his descendants went to Italy, to Milan, and they did very well in the banking world, I think. And so they came back, and they built this lovely inn out of the log cabins that were already there. So they're still the log cabins, but they're bed and breakfast in quality, even for the United States. They're very nice. And as a tribute to what their grandfather did. And that's where we stayed. And they, instead of being bitter, they've made something beautiful out of this. And that's the main place where we stay and have dinners with everybody and have, get to know the other families and get to know some of the Serbians. So I'm very inspired by that story too, that they've come back and made something wonderful out of that farmhouse.
Just to make sure, your dad's name is George Vujnović,
Correct.
and your mom is Mirjana
Mirjana.
Vujnović, yes.
She was Lazic before she was married.
Yes, just to get those names recorded. Was your dad also and your mom probably behind 1946 when Draža was jailed and that so-called trial was in place? There was demonstration in New York of the pilots. Was your dad behind organizing that as well?
I was still kind of a toddler, but I think so. Certainly,
You were 2 years old. Yeah.
I think that it wasn't only my father, though, because I've seen pictures of the demonstrations of the airmen themselves who were rescued and sheltered by the same farmers I was talking about. And they have placards saying, Draža Mihailović saved our lives. U.S. airmen. Now let us save his. And they marched around, and that was very moving. I think they were in Washington. I think they were also perhaps in New York. But I'm pretty sure they came to Washington to demonstrate. And they asked for approval to go to Belgrade and testify on Mihailovic's behalf, that indeed he did rescue all of these hundreds of airmen who were allies, and Americans and other allies. And not only did he rescue them, because remember, he was accused of being a collaborator with the Germans and Italians, but not only were they rescued, but if they were in good health, which most of them were, they were sent right back into the war against the Germans. So there was no way a collaboration to rescue 500 Allied airmen. So they were denied permission, of course, by the Yugoslav government. Even our government wasn't pushing it, but they probably could have gone if the Tito's government had been allowed if they were allowed to go, but they were not allowed to go. So they got a lot of press in the United States, but they were not allowed to go. Well, I'm sure my father was part of that, but I think the airmen themselves wanted to do this.
Okay.
So I think it's a collaborative effort.
Yeah, because the trial was very short and abrupt, I would say.
Well, it was a communist
know
show
a lot.
trial in our
Yeah.
view. And I always heard about that since I was 2, probably. So, no, that was a terrible thing. And it certainly influenced me a great deal. And also the story of how he refused to be rescued, that he decided to share the fate of his people. And then many friends who told me their stories very much influenced me. So perhaps that's why I did a career in international relations and diplomacy. Part of it, for sure.
Your mother worked for Voice of America for a few
Yes.
years, and she did a noble thing by, she wasn't happy with, can you tell us that story?
Well, my mother was a rather feisty, indomitable lady. So she had good languages, both English and Serbian, of course. And my parents had worked in Jerusalem first, broadcasting when they had just kind of escaped from occupied Yugoslavia, broadcasting into occupied Yugoslavia, high morale messages as if they were still in the country. So she had some experience in broadcasting, is what I'm trying to say. So she got a job in the Voice of America in New York, and it used to be in New York at that time, probably around 1949. And she was a broadcaster and editor. There was a whole Yugoslav section. And they were broadcasting initially with the message of democracy, as the United States always does, and criticizing communism in Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia. But one day after the United States got very enthusiastic about Tito because he broke with Stalin, they were told, okay, from now on, in the Yugoslav section is to only criticize Stalinism, but not communism in Yugoslavia. And my mother said, that's really wrong, because the people are suffering there from communism. It isn't just Stalin, which is one big issue. So there was that contention, and her boss, whose name was Branko Danic, and who had been the one to hire them in Jerusalem and was a great mentor to my mother, a former journalist and press attaché from Yugoslavia. He was eventually fired because of this issue, basically. And then my mother and several other people from that section decided to resign in protest, and she wrote a very strong letter to the director, named John Armitage, about why she was resigning, and I have it somewhere. And I showed it to my husband and said, this is really strong. And she said that the reason that she was resigning is that she thought that Voice of America should be principled about communism and the abuses of communism, and instead they compromised. So that's why she resigned, and she said she hoped that with the new Republican administration under Eisenhower, it would change, but it didn't, so she had decided to leave. Even though she had a very nice career beginning there, and she could have stayed for her entire career, but she gave that up out of principle.
I know that there's Voice of America here in Washington, D.C., but this was New York.
It moved. Its headquarters, at some point, it moved from
So it was
New
in
York.
New York first.
At that time, the headquarters was New York. And then maybe in the 60s or so, it moved to Washington. But my mother said she would have moved. That wasn't the issue. The issue wasn't moving from New York to Washington. That she resigned out of that principle. So then she came home to be a stay-at-home mom with me, and I was very happy. Because the other little children of my age didn't have working mothers. They all had stay-at-home mothers in those days. So I was the only kid in the after-school program. So there's nobody to play with, so I just did my homework. It's very boring. So I was happy to have my mother at home. No more babysitters and after-school program.
So in the 50s, 60s, you could have a husband, generally it was husband, right? Most probably 99 out of 100 times, who was working and still could afford to provide for the whole family, maybe even a small house. And that's not the case anymore. Now we have to have it, both of the parents working, and just that American dream is a little bit of just a dream now.
Well, I see it a little differently from you. I mean, I don't see
Okay.
it exactly as that way. I think that in the 1950s, well, the men were all coming home in the 40s from war in the United States. And a lot of the women had taken their places in offices and factories. And there was a big sociological problem there because they all needed jobs. And those men were generally ready to get married and have children after war. A lot of them were bachelors through the war. So there was an actual effort by the government to discourage the women from keeping their jobs, opening it up to men. And that's been documented. They even hired psychiatrists to write about this and say this is not good for women to be outside the home. And so then the men would get the jobs back and the women would be homemakers and take care of the children. So part of that was a deliberate policy. So I'm not sure that this was all the American dream, but this is the way it was in the 1950s. My mother was working, and I think she enjoyed working despite being a mother. She liked that too, of course, but she liked the intellectual challenge of working. And I have to say that in the 60s and 70s, I was very happy to see the women's movement asserting the right of women to get into the professions and have equal pay for equal work. And to me, that was an improvement, even though it made my life and other people's lives, other women's lives, harder, in the sense that we had to both work, and if we wanted families, we had to do that after work. But I like the dignity of having the work and having my own income and not being a total dependent, I have to admit.
Of course.
So I think it's an improvement.
No, I was just making a comment that you could actually survive on one salary back in those days, versus right now, I don't know if that's still the case.
I think it was hard on my father because he was starting his own business, so it was up and down. And other people maybe, yes. And then the new people we met from Yugoslavia who were coming in, it was hard in the beginning for them to survive on one salary.
Got it.
But later, yes. Later, when they were established, then yes, there were many families who would have the man be the breadwinner and the money earner, and the woman take care of the house and children and educate them. And that was fine too.
And they stayed in New York their whole lives?
After that, yes. They stayed in the same house.
Okay.
They traveled, but they stayed in the same
And
house.
your dad, after he retired from OSS, because OSS became CIA basically, right?
Yes. So OSS was abolished in 1947 by President Truman. And then they decided, well, we really do need some kind of intelligence agency, but not this kind of improvised one. So they formed a more bureaucratic one called the CIA. But in the end, my father decided to move to New York and then start his own business. I think that he was kind of disillusioned by our policy not to support General Mihailovich.
Got it. And his business was airplane parts? Did you?
Yes. He first went to work for Pan American, where he had worked in Africa for them on air transport under Lend-Lease to the British in North Africa. So when he left the military, he had re-employment rights with Pan American. So when they moved to New York, there was a little detour to California, but then they moved to New York. And he worked for Pan American for a while. And then somebody offered him a partnership in a small private business in aircraft parts. And he decided to do that. He liked to be his own boss, basically, too. But then that business didn't prosper, so found that one went bankrupt rather quickly. So he decided to form his own business. Very little money. My mother helped form it, and he had a storefront office in Jackson Heights near our house. And then he gradually built that business. But it was always a small business.
Was it still an aerospace industry?
Yes, it was the Aerospace was its name, and it was aircraft parts.
Okay.
So he did not manufacture. He sold aircraft parts, so he would be a distributor. So his clients would say, we need these specialized parts assembled, and he would get various parts from different suppliers and then send it to the clients. So he had several important clients.
That story about him in Africa trying to get or trying to get a visa where there's big crowds in front of the embassy. That's a really nice story. Do you mind sharing that?
Not at all. Thank you for your interest in all these wonderful stories. My parents, having kind of escaped from Yugoslavia, I guess, they had a long odyssey from Budapest to Istanbul to Jerusalem and then finally Cairo. And in Cairo, they went to an Orthodox church, I think Russian Orthodox, for Vidovdan. And there my father met Colonel Krager, a Yugoslav who was in the Air Force and was working for Pan American in Africa. And I don't know how they struck up a conversation, but my father was very friendly. So they did. And, I guess, how do you happen to be here for Vidovdan? Because that's a Serbian holiday that's not shared by the other Orthodox Christians. And they struck up a conversation, and Krager said, well, I'm here to meet somebody because to interview him for a job in Africa with Pan American, but he didn't show up, and I don't think he's here in Cairo. So my father said, I'd like to apply for that job, not knowing really much about it. And so they talked, and he said the job is actually in West Africa, working with Pan American, and we're supplying the British in North Africa. So we get supplies from the United States via Brazil, and then they hop over to West Africa, and then we send them on to North Africa. And we need somebody for our installations there in Ghana and Nigeria. And he said, I'm interested. And so Mr. Krager said, well, okay, I'm hiring you. I think you have the qualifications, but only if you can get a visa from the British here in Cairo to go to Accra and to Lagos, which are still British colonies administered by the British. So my father said, okay, but I'll need a visa for my wife too. She's with me. He said, okay, both of you then. So off my father goes to try to get a visa. And apparently because Rommel and the Germans were getting close to Cairo. They were getting towards El Alamein. The British were having trouble stopping them. The Americans weren't even in the war yet, seriously. And so there were all these panicked people, he said, at the British consulate or whatever, their consulate there, at the gates trying to get in, trying to get a visa to get out of there. And my father walks in and he says to the guard, I need to see the consul general. On what business, sir? I can't tell you, it's confidential. I'm with American intelligence. So they said, just a moment, sir. And they let him in. Same story with the receptionist. I can't tell you, it's confidential, but I need to see the consul general. So he gets up to the consul general's office. And the consul general is very nice and says, how can I help you? Well, I need a visa for myself and my wife. We're Americans. We're going to Accra and Lagos to help with this, to help them, with the war effort. And he said, well, exactly what business? I can't tell you. It's confidential, but it is definitely part of our war effort together. And then he stamps all the visas and says, good luck, sir. And he shakes his hand and he's out. And these other people are still waiting at the gate. And my mother is waiting kind of around the corner for him. And she sees that he's back in like less than an hour. And she started to cry and say, oh dear, we'll never get out of here. You couldn't get it. And he said, no, I have all the visas, see? And she said, George, how did you do it? And he said, I can't tell you. It's confidential. So he was that way. He was resourceful and a little mischievous. But he was able to do things that way. So they both went off to West Africa together. And he was working for Pan American initially, so it was okay that my mother was there because they were both civilians. But very soon afterwards, the United States got more involved in the war effort, and they militarized Pan American in Africa. So then my father was given a choice. You can either go home and go back to Pan American headquarters, or you can stay here and become a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and you'll be an officer, and then you'll be part of the military. So I guess they discussed it, and he decided he would accept that. But he thought that my mother could stay. So she stayed for a while, but these soldiers were coming in. And then one evening there was a movie that they went to, that they showed, for the American movie for the military and the civilians there. And my mother was the only one, young lady, wife, in the audience. Oh. And they're whistling and making remarks. And the commanding officer called my father in the next day and said, sorry, George, this cannot continue. She's the only wife on the entire base. They're all envious. She is going to be sent home. Uh-huh. But home was to her Belgrade. But of course, home to him was the United States. So my mother was sent back to the United States, her first time in her life. And then that's how she ended up here and in Washington. Mm-hmm. And she was very lucky because though she went to Pittsburgh to meet my parents, her parents-in-law and her sisters-in-law and brothers-in-law, but she was lucky that she knew somebody in the Yugoslav embassy in Washington. She knew the political counselor, and he was a good friend, and introduced her, and they hired her.
She had to hustle herself to get that job. It wasn't...
She did, but I think that this friend also helped her a lot. He was the political counselor. She had languages. Fortunately, she had really good English, more British English than American English, but she was a teacher of English literature in the gymnasium in Serbia, in Belgrade. So English was her profession. And then she also was able to do some decoding and some translations. So they did say they could use her, and fortunately, she was hired right away. And that was really lucky because I think this is where she wanted to be if she was going to be in the United States, as she was working with the Yugoslav government in exile, and she was in a sophisticated capital such as it was in those days.
So she was doing some coding and decoding of messages that went back and forth and
That's what I understand. And also translations of diplomatic notes and things. That's what she told me. But of course, I wasn't there. There is a funny coincidence. I don't know if your audience would be interested, but I'll try. So of course, I didn't even know of the existence of my husband at the time, and nor did she. And at the time, there was a lady named Ruth Mitchell, was rather prominent in Washington, but she was also very pro-Serbian. And she had gone over to Yugoslavia to help the war effort for a while as an ambulance driver or something like that. And then she was, I think she was captured by the Germans, but they got her out because she was an American and the U.S. was not in the war yet. But she rented Ted's parents' house in Virginia, which was a big house, so that she could invite people to receptions and try to lobby for the Serbian resistance cause. And oddly enough, and then she hired a very nice young Serbian American lady from Pittsburgh, a young woman in her 20s, to be her assistant. And this young woman knew my mother a little bit from the embassy and invited my mother over to talk about the works they were doing and trying to help. Okay, that's Ted's parents' house, my future husband's parents' house. So my mother, in the 40s, before I was even born, visited their house. They weren't there anymore. They had rented it to Ruth Mitchell, and Ruth Mitchell was doing a wonderful job trying to influence members of Congress and the press to look at what Draža Mihailović and what the Serbian people were doing to resist the occupation of the Germans. That was her effort. And she was a wonderful person. Unfortunately, it didn't all turn out as we hoped. But it was a strange coincidence that so many years later, I would have anything to do with my husband or that house, which is long gone from his family. But still,
Right.
I thought it was a strange coincidence.
Right, right. Share with us, please, with your life experiences. I'm sure you had seen something that somebody might call coincidence, but what I call God finger in our life. Do you have anything you could share with us?
Well, of course, there have been times when I've been very lucky to escape death. There are times when it hasn't been so lucky about other people around me. But there is one incident, if you want to hear about my life, right here in the patio outside where we're sitting. I was sitting one day reading some mail and having my lunch. And there had been a storm the day before, but it was a beautiful October day. And my husband had decided not to join me for lunch. He wanted to rest upstairs. And I was at a little table, and suddenly I heard a horrible wind noise and banged I just put my hand over my mail stack. And that's all I remembered. And the next thing I knew, I was on the ground, and there was a tree all around me on the ground with branches and leaves. And I'm lying there on my patio without understanding a thing. I was in shock. And then a man approached me in a workman's uniform, and it said Franklin on the lapel of the shirt. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Franklin." And I said, "What are you doing in my garden?" And he said, "You had an accident. I'm here to help you." And I didn't understand. I said, "What happened? I don't understand." And I tried to get up, and I couldn't. And Franklin disappeared. And my husband arrived from upstairs. And he said, "I've called an ambulance." And I said, "What happened?" He said, "A tree fell on you." I said, "I don't understand." He said, "A tree fell on you. It's fallen. It's right around you." And I said, "But Franklin was just here." He said, "There's no Franklin." He said, I heard it. I was in the bedroom and I heard it, and I went to the window and saw you were on the ground, and then I just called 911, and then I ran down to get you, to see you, and maybe that was half a minute. There's nobody else here. I said, "No, Franklin was here." So off to the hospital, etc. But when I didn't have life-threatening injuries, but I had injuries. When I was well enough to see my neighbors, I said, "You had some workmen that day. I wondered if you had a Franklin." "No." I asked both sides. "No, we don't know any Franklin." "Are you sure?" So I never knew whether Franklin was my guardian angel who was speaking to me in English and saying, "I've come to help you," but that's all I knew. Or whether there was a neighbor who had hired him and he jumped over somehow, and maybe they didn't focus on his name. But that one was a little bit of a miracle, maybe. What do you think?
It was a big of a miracle, the tree to fall on you and not kill you. It's
Well, that was fortunate. That was where I was sitting. But had my husband joined me and been on the opposite side, that's where the trunk hit. And what hit me was a dead tree, which I hadn't really focused on. The whole tree came over. It was very long. And the branch hit where I was sitting, and then the table smashed on me and pushed me over. So I had a concussion, I had broken wrist, broken hand, broken shoulder, but I didn't have life-threatening injuries. Had he been on the opposite side, nobody on the opposite side of the table would have survived the trunk. So I was very lucky that it was only part of the tree that hit me. But I thought that Franklin was a very unusual part of the story.
well, thank you for it. Today, Saint Gabriel is celebrated, so it's Archangel Gabriel, the bearer of good news. So maybe it was your angel?
Franklin could be my angel. I think of my little cat who's named Angel as my angel. I'm very convinced that she was sent from heaven to keep me company. So I think of those things, yes, but I'm just not sure. I mean, there's such a big universe, and we don't know if, at least I don't know, if God looks after every individual all the time.
I think
God has a lot to do, and we're
Yes.
learning more and more. It's very fascinating to see what this new telescope, the Webb telescope, is showing us about all these galaxies and so much that is in the universe. And if God created the universe, which I believe probably he did, then God is very busy.
Yes, well, I think our problem is that we're trying to put God in our time, space, and matter. But God is outside that. He created all of that. So looking every second and millisecond over all of us is what I
hard.
believe is happening. And it's hard. Yeah, it's
To
unimaginable,
understand.
unimaginable for us, but for God, it's.
Well, I'll tell you my personal belief sometimes. I mean, it's not from the church, but at my best moments, I say to myself, God gave each human being something godlike in themselves if they want to try to achieve it. And so we have free will to decide whether we'll go on the best path we can go on or the worst, which would be really awful, or just something mediocre. But if you want to take your inspiration from the spark that God put within each of us, then you're doing your best work or your best effort, or you're helping people the most you can do, or animals, or whatever you want to do, or the environment, or whatever your cause is. That, I think, is the spark of God within each of us. But that's a personal belief. It's not necessarily.
It's
In that
beautifully
sense.
said, and I really think we should finish with that.
Okay. I think
Thank you very much.
probably our time is up. Well, I want to thank both of you for your time and your interest and your efforts with me, and to come all the way over here and work with me, and your interest in our story, my family's story and my story. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to talking to some of the members of the parish if they're interested in learning more.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Okay, here we have our Mihailovich corner. So this is my father in uniform. And this is the dagger that he sent to my father in Bari to thank him for organizing the evacuation and the Halyard mission. And it has some inscriptions, so you can take a look. Maybe you can read them. I can't see them right now. And then this is just a little bust of General Mihailovich that I found in my parents' things when they passed. So I wanted you to see that. So this is the medal that he got from the United States, from the Army, and says from the President, it's the Army, called the Bronze Star Medal. And that's a well-known medal for his work on the Halyard mission, for organizing the Halyard mission. It has a beautiful inscription, and you might want to go a little closer to see it. But I think that's his most important award. And he got that in 2015 at the age of 95, if you can imagine, because the mission was kept secret for a very long time. So it's only after the records of the OSS were declassified that we could substantiate that. He was nominated by a faculty member at West Point, and then it had to be substantiated. So I helped. My PhD helped me in that, because I went up to College Park to the National Archives, and I found the records of the OSS, which had been declassified, and there was a box about the Halyard mission, so I was able to help that way. And then they said that he couldn't have his medal. That's what a member of Congress staff told me, because Congress has to approve these medals, unless he had an honorable discharge from the Army, because he was an Army officer, and then all those records had been destroyed in a fire in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in the 70s, so only 20% were saved. So we decided to take a chance and ask for the records and the discharge. And I was with my father in his house in Jackson Heights. And the mailman dropped in an envelope from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And we opened it, and there was his discharge. So that was another minor miracle that it survived the fire. And that was the last impediment. That was the last thing that had to be done before he could get his medal. So he said that he wanted to get his medal in St. Sava's Church, in the church hall, which he did. And then his congressman said he wanted to present the medal to him there. So Congressman Joe Crawley presented it to him. And the press covered it really intensively. The press covered it all over the world, in fact, besides the United States. But the New York Times and the AP and the television, they were actually practically mobbing us. And he was giving interviews even at 95. He was very lucid about the Halyard mission. He always remembered this. So this was very special. So this was mission accomplished for him at age 95. So these are the principal actors in the Halyard mission on the American side. So there's my father. They gave me this as a present. This is not that he was necessarily the boss of all these people at all, but this was a present to me for Christmas one year. And so this is General Twining. He was the head of the Air Force unit that rescued the airmen. General Mihailovich, of course. General Donovan, who was the head of the OSS. This is Captain George Mussolin. Captain Nick Lalich, who was the last head of the liaison mission with Mihailovich, and Arthur Jibalian, who was the radio operator who was with the missions, and a great hero. He was originally, I think, of Armenian extraction, but a great friend to all of these heroes. And he was a hero himself. And he has a daughter who's surviving him too. So we're a whole group of daughters who have survived these heroes. Do you know what this one is? It's very old.
No.
This is the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest medal anyone can get in the United States. So my father-in-law was Theodore Wilkinson, the same name as his son, my husband. He was a career Navy, went to Annapolis to the Naval Academy and did his whole career in the Navy. So when he was a young ensign on one of his first assignments, he went to Veracruz, Mexico, and their unit was ordered to take the city. It was during the Mexican Revolution. And they charged up and they took this major port city, and he got the Medal of Honor for that. But then later, he stayed in the Navy. He was through World War I. World War II came. He was the director of naval intelligence first, and then he became an admiral in the Pacific, and he was in the South Pacific with Admiral Halsey, who was quite famous. He was a deputy of his, and they did a lot of, he was in charge of the amphibious landings in the South Pacific of the U.S. Marines and Navy. So he was, he was very distinguished, but unfortunately he died in 1946 in an accident. So he didn't live very long after that, and I never knew him.
Yeah.
But I told Ted we couldn't keep this in the attic. He brought it down from the attic one day and said, "Look what I found in the attic." And I said, "We cannot keep that in an attic.
Exactly.
We're going to hang this up."
You play piano?
I used to. My mother was a really good pianist, but she tried to get me to play. I had lessons for about 12 years, but I was not very good. I still do play Christmas carols. Come and sit down, if you can. This is a beautiful album that my cousin's daughter, Olga, who's a great friend also, made for me. She lives in Novi Sad, but she spends a lot of time in the States too. This is my mother as a young lady. Mm-hmm. And this is also my mother. So this is the family history of my mother's side for a while.
Green eyes?
Blue.
Blue?
Very beautiful blue eyes. And then her two older brothers, Mirko and Milan. Well, then more family. I mean, I won't go through everything. Oh, dear. Well, my grandmother, Olga. My grandfather, George, another George. He was the engineer I spoke about who worked on the railroads. And then, I guess, when they were babies, I never knew my
Sarajevo, right?
grandparents. What?
In Sarajevo, I think.
Well, she was born in Sarajevo because he had an assignment in Sarajevo, but they lived mainly in Belgrade. He was first from Zemun originally, so he went to Graz, to the university, and became an engineer, and then was employed by the Austro-Hungarian Railroad at the time, and had assignments in Mostar and Sarajevo. And then during World War I, he became a prisoner in Romania. And after World War I, when the Serbian side won, he was released and they moved to Belgrade soon after. And he continued his career with the railroad, the National Railroad. So, there. So anyway, these are old pictures of my...
Is your mom too?
With a big bow. That seemed to be the fashion, to make big bows. So that's my little mom. And then Olga made me this beautiful album because I didn't know these relatives. Unfortunately, most of them died before I could meet them. So I never met my uncles or grandparents on that side. Trip to Venice, and then here comes my father into her life. And here's my father as a little boy, just a little boy. And, well, these are old. This is a nice picture of my mother and father dating in Belgrade. This is what they looked like when they were dating in Belgrade. And he always was, she liked him to be well-dressed in a suit, a coat and tie. So he wore a coat and tie for the rest of his life, except for July and August, when it was too hot. But she always dressed nicely, too. I mean, they were a little bit more formal in that sense. So my uncle, whom I never, unfortunately, knew, he was also an engineer. And then, well, this is a church, obviously. My mom and dad, when they were dating, also much more informal, or young married, I don't know which, but. And then there's my father in uniform, military uniform. I think poor Vladimir is tired of me. Do you want to see this? My father in uniform, that's kind of nice. You tell me if I can change it then. And then, of course, this is Rome, because there's the Castello. And then, well, these are passport photos, basically. And then there's my mother and father working on his first business when he went into business for himself. So she was helping him. I think that's rather sweet, because I worked with my husband. This is when they were in Cairo, so they visited the Sphinx.
Was it after the war?
During. Remember, they met Mr. Krager, and then they were sent.
That's when it happened.
That's the only time, yes. And then they're newly married. Here's the Sphinx.
Still standing.
Yes, that's surviving us all. And the pyramid, which does look like that. It was only when I got to Cairo that I saw that the pyramid wasn't smooth. And then, well, they were in camels at one point, but I don't know if I have any camel pictures. But they were funny. I don't know, did they? Well, they're in Arab dress. And they're in an Orthodox church in Egypt, of which there are many. And then guess who this is?
Oh, let's see.
Guess who this is? She was cuter then. Baby Xenia.
I'm looking for the giraffe.
No, I think I have some other animal.
Teddy bear.
I guess the giraffe wasn't in my pictures, or I would have been crying. No, but I usually liked him. And then this is with my father when I was little. I didn't really meet my father right away because he was at war when I was born. My poor mother that was hard for her, a foreign country, and then having a baby, and her sister-in-law came, but still wasn't her close, original family. but she managed. And I was born here in Washington. So that's me growing up. Well, that's more than you want of me growing up. And then my parents in New York with their family. And this couple, they were in Serbia together. He was a doctor who was one of my father's student companions from this scholarship fund, Vasa Purlia. But he stayed in Yugoslavia, finished his degree, and then got out through the Halyard Mission, actually, with his wife. And then he became a doctor in the United States in the public health service. Well, anyway, these are pictures of family gatherings. These are my relatives from Boston. And that's me pouting. And my little birthday party. And so it's cute. But I mean, this is just to give you an idea of
Oh, it's great.
growing up. This is like in our dining room in New York with some. I think this is a slava because look what, or maybe looks like.
Definitely the candles.
My mother always celebrated the Serbian Orthodox Christmas and Easter and Slava with an event. And she had the candle with the colors of the Serbian flag that she, or maybe it's the church too, but she always had that traditional candle. And she made the zito. I can make zito, that's one thing I can do, despite my bad cooking. And she didn't like to cook that much either. So that's it. I mean, that's me when I was a little older, college and high school, I guess, and college. And then this is baby Julia, probably. So that's Julia. Julia, you haven't met her, but she is in these pictures, my daughter. So here she is. She's very pretty, I think. But then mothers are, of course, prejudiced. And I have two lovely stepdaughters through Ted. So here is Julia. Here is kind of a better. She's with my father there. That's his medal ceremony. And then here she is with me.
I see, I see.
That was my 60th. And then here she is graduating from Columbia.
So she red hair?
Well, she had it that time. That was a phase.
Okay.
It's a phase. The hair can be changed. But she was born very blonde. This is Julia as a little girl. So she was very, very blonde.
Pretty.
But then she became darker blonde. And here she is more recently with her fiance.
What year was she born?
83. So she's over 40.